Hi, welcome back to Space Thoughts. Today is another hopefully short video that builds on the last video that I did about the Titan submarine incident and how my impression was that there was going to be a lot of how you say hyperbole about comparing it to the commercial space industry, which has actually happened in a lot of regards. The media has jumped on this a lot, and so has social media, and so has certain people that follow this and basically harp on this a lot. Um, Again, we talked about that, why they're apples to oranges, and I don't think they're the same. I won't relitigate that. But what I want to talk about today is a lot of some comments that I've seen that there is no regulation in the commercial space industry, which basically says that oh, it's the same as a Titan. It was reckless. It was and such, and that isn't true. Now, as I talked in the last video, I told you that the FAA is currently in a moratorium period as far as issuing regulations for the commercial space industry, and that moratorium ends in October of this year. And I think anyways, given everything that's going on, public perceptions and political pressure, I think that moratorium is going to end, and there's going to be a period. We're going to enter into a new period where the FAA will have authority to regulate it. But what I really want to get onto right now is this idea that there is no regulation, specifically for the crew, protecting the crew, or considering the crew and space flight participants for that matter. Now, again, as I mentioned, the FAA does not certify these spacecraft, and that's what they are. They're spacecraft. They're not airplanes. And and because of that, this is where the big where a lot of the hyperbole and just a lot of screeching in some respects is coming out from. And that's and I understand that, but just because it isn't certified, that doesn't mean there isn't regulations. And I keyed on two particular regulations that deal specifically with the safety of the crew and space flight participants, and we'll look at them here. Specifically, Title 14, Chapter 3, Subchapter C of the Code of Federal Regulations deals with human spaceflight requirements. So basically what the FAA said, okay, we can't certify these spacecraft. We're hands off right now because Congress has given us a moratorium and says we cannot regulate. And Congress is the only one who can give the FAA that type of authority. But what Congress did say is you're going to have, to a minimum, you got to have some sort of safety regulations in there. And this is what happened. I'm not going to go through each of these ones individually because that'll make a very long video, and I don't think anybody wants to sit through it. I know I wouldn't want to sit through it. But just to highlight on a few things, that part 460 is actually broken up into two subparts. One dealing with launch and reentry with crew, and launch and reentry with spaceflight participant. Now, again, just briefly looking at some of these things, and again, I'll have a link to this in the description so that you can actually go look at these at your leisure, and decide for yourself, these types of regulations are effective or not. But basically, they talk about crew qualifications and training, operator training. In other words, operator is a company like, say, Virgin Galactic or Blue Origin, the actual company that owns the spacecraft and is performing the activities. Basically set some standards for that. Informing crew of risk, which is basically saying, we're going to, this basically whole idea, you understand this is a dangerous activity, and even if you want to do it and you're getting paid for it, there is a chance, you could die, which actually happened during testing a spaceship a few years back. Environmental control and life support system. So in other words, this is basically where the FAA is saying, look, you're going to have minimum, you've got to have environmental controls and life support systems for these spacecraft. And actually, we'll take a look at that real quickly. This is what it is. It's very short and sweet, but basically you got to have, it basically says, this is the type of atmosphere you got to have. This is the pressure, temperature, and humidity you have. You got to make sure the contaminants are properly filtered out. You have ventilation and circulation. And you've got to make sure you have a backup oxygen supply just in case something goes wrong. And the operator must also provide a redundant means of preventing cabin depressurization or prevent incapacitation of any of the flight crew in the event of cabin pressure. In other words, if something goes wrong or you use cabin pressure, you've got to have some sort of, maybe a mask for the crew to actually put on so that they can get the spacecraft down without further incident. So again, this is a basic requirement, and this is actually about the vehicle itself. So in a sense, it is a regulation of the vehicle or the minimum standards that the vehicle must meet. Human factors, again, basically, this is basically saying the operator must make the spacecraft in a way that the crew knows the layout and can store individual objects, and basically operate it in a manner that will allow the crew the minimum amount of physical stress during the whole operation. Again, this is about actually the spacecraft itself. So in a sense, it is a regulation of what the spacecraft needs to be. Verification program. This is a big one. This basically says that the operator must verify integrated performance between the software and the hardware. In other words, the software needs to be right and it has to be talking to the hardware so we don't have any problems. But until a operator can demonstrate that, the FAA isn't going to license it for spaceflight participants. And this was actually an issue Virgin Galactic had with a prior license back a couple of years ago. It basically the FAA was basically adamant, right in the license, you cannot fly space flight participants until you show us that the software and the hardware are talking to each other and working correctly with the spacecraft. I mean, during that time, they were allowed to perform revenue flights with scientific equipment and such, but they couldn't take any space flight participants. It just had to be crew. Since then, they've demonstrated the FAA satisfaction, and now they have a license because they've actually verified it. So a lot of this is about the crew and how the crew actually integrates with the spacecraft. So there is some regulation here. Spaceflight participants they have a little bit less because basically they're just along for the ride. This again, 460.45, informing the spaceflight participant at risk, which is basically part of the federal law. You got to do this, and actually, it's part of the state law too. But they operate in New Mexico. This is part of New Mexico's state law. You got to have that hold harmless. Spaceflight participant waiver claims against U.S. government. In other words, spaceflight participant can't sue the U.S. government for this. They basically wash their hands. Spaceflight participant training. So there is a little bit about this. An operator must train each spaceflight participant for flight on how to respond to emergency situations, including smoke, fire, loss of cabin pressure, and emergency exits. Now, you can compare this to the airline industry, where when we're all taxiing out to the runway on the airline, the flight attendants are going through the emergency procedures where the emergency exits are. This is probably similar in scope, maybe a little bit more intensive than what we would find on an airline. I don't know if you pay attention to them. I do, and I'm sure the spaceflight participants on this are paying a lot of attention too. I mean, that's not to say these emergency procedures are going to work, but they have to be trained and understand have a minimum amount of training. So in essence, what my point is, while people are saying, well, there's no regulations for crew safety and spaceflight participant safety, that's false. This is these minimum regulations are in place, and this is what Congress said. You can regulate to this extent because we got to have something in place, especially if we're going to have civilians or spaceflight participants going on these spacecraft. So again, that's that. But again, we don't have the certification. We don't have certification, and this whole idea of certification, I think what people really want to see is something like what the FAA has with aircraft, where they certify each type of aircraft and each subtype of aircraft. They have that authority, and actually they have that expertise to do that. But my question is, moving forward, if Congress says, you got to, the FAA, you got to certify these spacecraft. I don't think the FAA really has that knowledge right now, and I think it's going to take a long time to gain that knowledge because really there are no standards. And the question is the FAA in a position to create standards? And my answer is I don't think they are. That is a definite no. It's a lawyer thing, but my answer is I don't think they are. Just because, well, they're a government agency. There's a bureaucracy involved, and it's going to be hard to create. And who better to create standards though than the industry? 10 years ago, I co-authored this article with two other experts, and we talked about this thing called classification societies. What are classification societies? Well, in a nutshell, classification societies are these non-governmental organizations that basically creates in the maritime industry. They basically get together and decide on what standards should be for shipbuilding and ship maintenance and modification, or what have you. These agencies have experts employed by them and inspectors who go out to shipyards and will inspect a vessel and look for certain things based on the standards created by the industry. And basically, if everything passes, they'll sign a certificate, basically saying the vessel is certified. The ship owner will then take that certificate and go to a company like Lloyd's of London and pass it over, and they'll look at it, and based on the recommendation and the certification of the classification society, they will insure the vessel. Now that's very simple on how the whole thing is, but that's basically what it is. So our idea was basically to take this precept from maritime law, and you all know how much I hate comparing the oceans to outer space, but in this case, this would probably be one of those many exceptions that I have to my hard and fast rule. But basically taking this idea and creating classification societies for commercial space. In other words, creating these NGOs, these private nonprofit companies that basically help develop standards for the industry. In other words, self-regulate the industry and get together with industry to create standards on what is basically acceptable safety standards, and then had sent inspectors to these various factories that are creating these spacecraft and basically certify them. Now, this will address a lot of issues. One, it'll address public confidence in these vehicles. It'll definitely help with insurance, and it'll definitely help on the political end as well. The question is getting these things implemented, and that's a long, arduous process. I think one of the issues that we talked about here was that classification societies in the maritime setting are have liability immunity under federal law. In fact, it's actually in the U.S. Code of U.S. State Code. That has gives immunity to classification societies. That was one of the things that that this type of industry would need. We actually presented this back in about 2015, I believe it was, and down in DC to some staffers, and it didn't really get much attention. It kind of fizzled out because right at that time that we presented it, Congress had already granted a new moratorium period for the existing moratorium period. Now that this is coming to an end, one of the things I would like to see is maybe to revive this idea, and instead of the FAA getting involved of creating standards and certifying these vehicles, actually let the industry regulate itself. Now, a lot of people are going to get up in arms. Oh yeah, that's like putting the mouse in charge of the cheese supply. Well, maybe not, but the industry has a interest in being safe and not having accidents. So really, and they are the people. These are the individuals, the entities actually building these spacecraft. And you got to remember, these spacecraft are also going to include orbital spacecraft, like the Axios mission. I believe it was the Axios missions, private missions to the ISS. Those were actually private missions; they were not government missions. Actually, the SpaceX capsules are in a sense certified for government astronauts for NASA use, but they're not certified for private astronauts. And this is where classification societies come in. They could provide they could help create standards with industry and then send inspectors out and actually certify these spacecraft or actually meet these standards, which they could pass on to an insurance company. And again, give some confidence that these spacecraft and the industry is moving forward in a responsible direction. Whether it'll happen or not, I don't know. I kind of fear that there's going to be a lot of prescriptive regulation in place because of political pressure. That's just my opinion, but we'll see. But again, this is something we talked about, to actually provide a means of actually certifying these typical spacecraft. So what I wanted to get out of this is, one, people are saying there's no regulation for these spacecraft or the safety of the crew or space flight participants. That's false. They're there. They're very minimal, but they're there, and they'll probably grow in scope and be beefed up a lot once the moratorium is over, and presuming the FAA gets more authority from Congress to actually regulate the industry. Second thing I want to do is show you that article we actually wrote 10 years ago, and the idea, because I think it's a valid idea. I think it would work. and I think it would be very beneficial to the industry. But again, one of the huge issues that we outlined here is, that idea of immunity, basically immunity from liability in terms of, performing these things, which is actually a standard in the maritime industry. Yeah, I'm comparing outer space to the ocean environment again. And it bugs me too. But anyways, those are the two things I wanted to talk about. I'm going to have a link to the regulations that I talked about and the article in the description so you can actually read up on them at your leisure. Anyways, it's a holiday here in the US. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll talk to you next time.